People point to this brief period in the 20th century that was somewhat worker-friendly, not to diminish the violent interventions and the oppression of racialized people and whatnot during this time. But they point to this era as an indicator of capitalism succeeding, compared to now where it's failing or in decay or whatnot. And I think if you want to understand how we got all these reforms, you have to acknowledge the role that the socialist threat played in getting them. So can you reform capitalism without the existence of the social threat? I don't think that there's evidence there that that works. Furthermore, I think if we want to use the mechanisms of the past to achieve these things, we also have to remember that they were clawed back. So we can't use the same method if we want to have lasting change. Capitalism has these mechanisms built into it to claw back these gains. So capitalism is kind of a spontaneous system. It's always going to be trying to evade whatever regulation you put on it. So for example, in the 2010s, you had the rise of companies like Uber and Airbnb that they made profit purely based on the fact that they found a way around regulations for like taxis and hotels and whatnot. So whatever regulation you put on it, capitalism is going to try to find a way to innovate to get around the regulation. If you want to achieve better social benefits, using reformism, you're always going to be fighting against this spontaneity or ingenuity of capitalism.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a gem from this episode's discussion featuring Alice Malone. In this episode, we'll be discussing Alice's essay entitled Concessions, which is available to read at redsales.org and is linked in the show notes. This article, I believe, contains a well-sourced and foundational explanation regarding 20th century history that every socialist, and even every person who considers themselves progressive, should know. Alice skillfully illustrates how the gains and progressive feats fought and won by workers of the Soviet Union following the Russian Revolution challenged capitalist elites in the West to concede certain reforms to workers of their own countries. Reforms we've all benefited from, including desegregation, homeownership, investment in education, public health care, and more. We cover some of these concessions as well as how they have been noticeably impacted negatively by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Alice Malone holds a bachelor's degree in engineering and a PhD in biology, and works as a scientist at a Silicon Valley-based healthcare technology startup. This experience grounds her belief that there is a better socioeconomic system than capitalism for addressing the health needs and scientific questions of mankind. Alice enjoys reading, languages, and data science, and lives in Canada with her partner and cat. You can see her love for data science and Marxism in the app she developed, which highlights word frequencies in key Marxist texts, such as Das Kapital. This app is linked in the show notes as well. As you may already know, this show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute, as a Patreon subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content, which are currently under development depending on when you're listening to this. Thank you for your patience and shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AES the Podcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review if you have the time or even just a star rating. It really goes a long way. As always, what you can do to most help the show is to engage in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. Glad to welcome Alice Malone to the show. We'll be discussing her excellent article, which is featured on redsales.org, a website that I recommend all you check out for its countless valuable articles. So Alice's specific work that we'll be talking about today is entitled Concessions. Normally on the show, we talk about socialist countries and sometimes how they've impacted development in capitalist nations, but this episode will be focused specifically on that subject. So again, welcome to the show, Alice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this work.
So Alice, what in your experience has been the standard capitalist narrative regarding the increase of social, political, labor, and economic rights and liberties in the 20th century?
You look around what the United States or Canada or other countries in the West are like, and you want to say, oh, I would like to change things. You look at the history of how our social progress has been made. And I think the sort of predominant narrative is that, well, the system we have is currently fine for the most part. Maybe we can make some small adjustments to make it a little bit better. We can do this via reform. I think that there's sort of like a couple different ways that we think about this happening. Maybe it's bottom up, like people express their desires for social change by their vote preferences. by writing op-eds in the media, maybe doing like peaceful protests and demonstrations. I think there's also sometimes a narrative that this happens via top-down reforms. So people in charge realize the errors of their ways and that we should actually make things run a little bit smoother. Or that reform happens via sort of top-down self-interest, like, well, we could really sell a lot more products, a lot more Ford cars, if our workers made more wages. So we should pay our workers more. I think those are sort of the sort of narratives that I was familiar with. So electoral reform, voting, making really good arguments about the value for these social programs.
I can relate to having that experience as well. Particularly, you kind of briefly mentioned this, but like essentially the great man narrative, having a specific person who just, for example, we'll say use MLK as a person. He just had a dream, right? And through that dream, people woke up to realize that, oh, maybe we should, have protections against racism. Maybe we should rethink the way that our society functions. And that's definitely I would say, an incorrect way of looking at the way our society does progress. But we'll get more into the details of that in a second here.
Yeah, I think the fact that you brought up MLK is a really good example. Like Barack Obama, for example, loves the quote of MLK: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And that's kind of the whole conception. Like overall, we might make a few missteps, but we're getting to a better place slowly, gradually, but we are getting there, and that's sort of inevitable. And with the civil rights in particular, like you hear about Martin Luther King and these sit-ins and the marches in Selma and nonviolent movements and whatnot, but you don't hear so much about the role of the Black Panther Party, which was very popular and really scared the crap out of the elite institutions in the United States. But the way that we look back on it now, historically, is that these movements were kind of fringe or something and weren't really driving the narrative.
So is this the reason that you set out to write the piece in the first place, is realizing that this narrative existed and that there are holes in it? Or what was the specific reason you decided to write this article?
Yeah, exactly. So I had been trying to understand better how we got these social programs that I appreciated, like things like universal healthcare in Canada, where I live. And if you are trying to answer those questions, you have to start looking at things like 20th century history. And the more I started learning about 20th century history, the more I started finding these quotes and collection of examples where it's very clear that this narrative, the arc of the moral universe is long kind of thing, this narrative was not at all true. That instead there was a big role that the threat of the USSR and socialist movements in the 20th century played in terms of getting these social welfare programs.
Awesome. I did not know that you were in Canada. So that's great. It's great to always have another Canadian on the show to talk about these things. Again, I'd have a similar experience to yourself, particularly when you look at Canada's Medicare system or their universal healthcare system, universal in quotes, I would say. But if you look back at the early 20th century, or I guess the mid 20th century, and the origins of this movement in Canada, it really goes directly back to doctors in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s going to the Soviet Union, experiencing the healthcare system there, learning about it, and then coming back to Canada to promote it. And really, when the NDP in Saskatchewan first implemented their universal healthcare system, they're the first in Canada to do so, was kind of really the precursor to our current system. One of the chief advisors was someone who'd studied the Soviet Union extensively and been there and used his knowledge to really push for the system in Canada. So again, yeah, there's a lot of history that isn't necessarily focused on when it comes to the origins of programs or the social benefits that we experience today in the West, at least. This narrative really is presented, I feel like, in media, in books, in TV shows, as in the 20th century, we had these huge leaps in rights and liberties and opportunities, etc., for not just the people at the top, but other people as well. And the way it gets presented is that capitalism was doing this and socialism was trying to actually prevent any of these things from occurring. That socialism was not about freedom, but it was about repression, is about totalitarianism, etc. And so it's really, shows how much power the bourgeoisie have in regards to how our media system operates. So when it comes to textbooks, and again, TV shows and movies. Your work brought to mind this quote from the Communist Manifesto. And really, it can come down to perspective, right? Someone could say that X is freedom, and someone else could say that no, that's actually not freedom because it's taking away something from myself. So this is specifically a quote from the manifesto written by Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, which points out the rhetorical and material contradictions in the capitalist system. So I'm just going to read from it now. The quote reads, And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. He's talking about socialism here. By freedom is meant under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with the restricted selling and buying with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to communist abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, he's of course referring to the capitalists, you reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary conditions for whose existence is the non existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. So it's
Yeah,
a
that's
fire
great.
quote from Marx. I love that ending. It's probably one of my favorite one-liners. It has those biting one-liners every now and then. I think this quote really shows that, at least when it comes to the propaganda aspect of it, that really it's the framing. It's the framing of, or it's the position coming to this discussion or this understanding of history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think capitalism is really the freedom of private property, freedom of capital. And there's a good argument to be made that even capitalists aren't really free under capitalism. You always have to be doing exactly what produces the most profit. Otherwise, you get outcompeted by other capitalists and you become a worker instead of a capitalist with all the freedom that entails.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a very great point. So, with that said, what is the overall thesis of your article entitled Concessions in response to these popular narratives?
Summarizing it very briefly, the thesis is that the threat of the USSR's good example scared the West into giving its workers a social safety net and other benefits. So, putting it a little bit into a few more words, so the 1917 October Revolution that gave rise to the first workers' state in Russia, that posed a huge threat. That was a cataclysmic event in terms of how capitalists related to workers' movements. And in order to survive, capitalists had to make a series of concessions to these workers' movements that were very rightfully angry about terrible living conditions and terrible working conditions and massive wealth inequality. There was also a wave of national liberation movements that followed this, and they drew their inspiration in large part from the Soviet example. So that's countries like China and Vietnam, as well as throughout Africa. Another part of the essay is that capitalists are not good at coordinating with each other. Their thing is really to compete with each other instead and to swallow each other up. So, in order to achieve this strategic victory over the workers' movements, they had to coordinate, and the only real way that they could do that was via the state. So, a lot of the examples that I discussed in Concessions, the essay, are sort of state-led efforts to try to concede some things to the workers in a way that still kind of entrenches these concessions in the capitalist system. So they tend to happen in ways like making access to loans for houses or for education easier. So this is still, a capitalist method. You don't have the right to education. You have the right to access to a loan that will give you access to education. Or food stamps or vouchers. These are things that can be spent at private institutions. And then my article focuses very much on the concessions aspect, but I think it's also important to remember that there was also a lot of repression during the 20th century. So you had concessions to the reformist movements, the less radical workers' movements, and then you had repression of the radical fringes of these movements. So that would be like the Red Scare tactics and anti-communist party suppression and whatnot that was also happening at the same time. And then in building my article, the way I wanted to argue this point was to quote bourgeois sources. So, for example, I quote economists like Hayek, I quote Hoover, and things like that to show that there was really an intention to grant these concessions because of the threat of the USSR or the Bolshevik movement. I know that other people have done sort of a similar argument, looking at it from more of an economic or statistical kind of perspective, and Marxists have written it quoting Marxist theoreticians like Marx or Engels or Lenin and whatnot. So I really wanted to make this this is the voice of the bourgeois movement at the time and what they were really, really scared about.
Thanks for giving us that very succinct summary of your thesis. Now, I really want to get into the specifics of it, the examples that you very clearly lay out in the article. kind of break it down into separate topics. You talk about how home ownership in the U.S. was really a concession by the capitalist class as a result of the Soviet Union's emergence, about desegregation, racism, global health, education, human rights. So if we could get into the specific examples, let's start with home ownership. Could you detail how the Soviet Union impacted that change and what did that mean for those in the U.S.?
The logic for promoting home ownership by the capitalist class is the idea that people who are well invested in the capitalist system are less likely to overthrow it. So you can extend sort of the same kind of logic for home ownership as to 401ks, where your retirement security is very much tied to the success of the capitalist market. So you're going to feel some allegiance to things that make the money tickers go up. The state of things in the early 20th century, the US was still industrializing. So people were moving from the country towards cities, and you're having more and more renters who are renting expensive, low quality properties. And at this time, I think one thing I want to highlight is that the US was very capitalist. There was no social safety net at all. And the perspective towards government was that it should be very small and really only be there for protecting private property rights, managing like interstate business deals and whatnot. And so a lot of this part of the homeownership struggle that the capitalist class was grappling with was really like, how much role should the government have in the day-to-day goings-ons of people's lives? So I quote a few capitalists in this piece to start. So one that I thought was kind of emblematic of the conversation going on, there's a Washington Post op-ed by a banker in New York City. And he wrote in his op-ed, "Widespread and successful home owning activities in the United States this spring would do more to alleviate social unrest and build a bulwark against the encroachments of Bolshevism than any other single development." I provide a couple others, but briefly, like, people were very much terrified of another Bolshevik revolution happening on US soil. The tools that they rolled out to deal with this, they started out very light touch, like it was really like marketing, handing out pamphlets, providing resources, information. So there's a program called Own Your Own Home that was launched by the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and this was later taken over by the US Department of Labor, and it actually ended up later being led by future US President Herbert Hoover. And so, as I said, people did not want the government involved in things. So it very much was like starting out by handing out pamphlets, and then the Great Depression hit, and this was a huge crisis. The government felt like it had to do something because it was very worried about this very upset proletariat movement. And so they started making it easier to access loans. So they provided liquidity for banks that were essentially going under otherwise because of failure to pay mortgage payments. Later morphed into New Deal program under FDR. So the FDR administration founded the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And this granted loans to Americans, but it also started the process of redlining. So again, this made homeownership more accessible for people, made people more tied into the capitalist system, but it also did it in a way that was racist and entrenched people in this capitalist system.
Thanks for that, Alice. So would you say, I was thinking about this after I read your article, that at least when it comes to the home ownership example, is that an example of class collaboration?
Yeah. So I think like homeownership is not necessarily bad. I think it's good for people to feel secure in the places that they live and be able to make them their own and whatnot. I think what the issue with the issue with renting is that you have this big payment every month that forces you to sell your labor power in conditions that are perhaps not very good for you so that you can stay living in a place. In many ways, the way that we've implemented homeownership in the West is kind of the same thing, where you really have to make your mortgage payment, otherwise you lose your home. And if your home's underwater or something like that, then you're in an even worse spot. So yeah, I think it is sort of like a class collaboration, like you are making people invested in the real estate market, which, is a form of capital. At the same time, like, these are concessions, they were expensive, resulted in higher taxes. So business owners had to pay more money, the wealthy had to pay more money. So
I guess a potential antecedent to this home ownership, the rationale behind it, or a similar program to it, or one could consider the Homestead Act, passed, I believe, in the 1860s in the US, which was essentially a huge land giveaway of indigenous lands to European settlers who are coming over for virtually nothing. From what I understand, it was definitely an incentive for those European settlers to engage in settler colonialism, for example, in the removal of indigenous peoples from the land, in the extraction of resources, in the white supremacist system. So I see that as an antecedent. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, that's a good example too, because rather than having to pay for a military force or something to clear out those lands, they got individual people to do it for them.
One aspect of this home ownership play, or an ironic aspect of it, is that if you look at the countries that have the highest rates of home ownership, I guess maybe it's not ironic. Maybe it's really telling that the countries that have the highest rate of home ownership today are either socialist countries or former socialist countries. So if you look at the top, these are the top 10 countries with the highest home ownership rate. So you have Laos, Romania, Kazakhstan, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Cuba, North Macedonia, Vietnam, and China. And the ones following that are post-Soviet Eastern European countries. So again, I guess maybe this is telling that definitely in terms of home ownership, socialist countries in general, let alone the USSR, the Soviet Union, definitely posed a threat, a material threat, in regards to what workers could potentially see other places having. So I find that quite an interesting contrast between the two. Let's see where Canada sits at this. So yeah, the home ownership in Laos right now is rate is 96%. Canada, it is 68%.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
it's still pretty high in Canada.
That's the thing, is that Canada is doing pretty well relative to other countries. But when you look at all these socialist or post-socialist countries in like 90s, it's quite wild.
Yeah, so one fact I actually highlight in my essay is in the USSR, your housing payments were between 2.4 to 11% of your income. And like, I don't know, I can't imagine like my rent payments being that.
I know that'd be amazing. And like I'm pretty sure for the average person it's at least somewhere between like 30-40% at
Yeah.
least in terms of whether it's rent or mortgage of one's income. So I did an episode with Bruni de la Ma, who was born and raised in East Germany, and she talked about the reality of the home of housing in East Germany. And again, similar rates to what you just explained. There, it was kept low, and housing was seen as a right. East Germany claimed to, not have homelessness. It doesn't mean that everyone lived in a mansion or whatever, but or in the nicest house. But it did mean that everyone had a place to stay at the end of the day. Yeah, so let's move on to the next thing. Again, I found this one quite interesting as well when it comes to desegregation and the civil rights movement in the US, the gains made from that movement. Could you speak to that?
So the example that I talk about for the desegregation of the United States is the Brown versus Board of Education SCOTUS case. So this was in 1954 and is essentially we should segregate schools or not. This is a big part of American history and you hear about it all the time. But I think what you don't necessarily hear about is the context in which this conversation was happening. So you were in this rising tension between the USSR and the US. You had all these national liberation movements happening in Africa and Latin America and whatnot. The US was very concerned that these movements were going towards the socialist bloc as opposed to becoming liberal capitalist democracies. The US was trying to exert its soft power around the world, but a lot of countries very rightly called out, well, like people of color in your country are not being treated very well at all. This was highlighted by multiple different voices within the Brown versus Board of Education amicus briefings. So amicus briefings are sort of letters filed by people with expertise or in the community that would like the Supreme Court of the United States to consider some particular argument in their decision. So I can quote a few of these. So this is, for example, Attorney General James P. McGranery. He said, racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubts, even among friendly nations, as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. I also like democratic faith there. And then the ACLU, for example, they also highlighted that it was not only communist propaganda that was highlighting these contradictions, but even the liberal and conservative press around the world was talking about this. He further comments, our discriminatory practices in education, in employment, in housing have all been the subject of much adverse press comment in these foreign countries, which we are trying to keep in the democratic camp. So again, highlighting the role that tensions within the United States are impeding the United States' ability to exercise its soft power around the globe. Eventually, the Supreme Court of the United States, they did rule that schools should not be segregated, that separate but equal did not make any sense at all. They didn't mention specifically the sort of international context in their decision, but mainstream media was very quick to pick up on it. So you had all sorts of outlets like Newsweek, for example, commented on the fact that segregation has been a weapon of world communism. Now that simple lies shattered. So that was Newsweek, for example, after the decision. Time magazine also, I quote a few different outlets in my essay. I also wanted to point out, like in my essay, that this wasn't a top-down decision. That was just, some people were like strategically thinking about how can the United States do the best job it possibly can in oppressing socialist national liberation movements. This was the result of a lot, like decades of activism trying to get racial equality in the United States. But I think instead what I wanted to highlight is that this example shows that you had this very powerful revolutionary movement in the United States. The elites were terrified of this movement. There was an alignment of interests between the capitalist class and these revolutionary movements within the United States that led to desegregation.
Definitely the picture represented of that time period is lacking in terms of the international aspect of the civil rights movement in the US, whether that's the anti colonial movements taking place in Africa and Asia, or again, the existence of the Soviet Union. And yeah, so it's not really, this international pressure is not focused on. And when one can see that and understand it, the events that then take place after Brown v. Board make a lot more sense. Say, for example, the huge mass resistance that occurred following the decision in both the North and the South. It's like, yeah, no one was really, most white people were just not down for those changes, because it really clashed with how their society was organized. It wasn't like I'll put it wasn't like a common sense to whatever the common sense was for most of white America in the
Yeah, yeah.
1960s. It clashed with that, right? Like, say for example, I'll use, maybe this isn't a great example, but I'll use a Roe v. Wade for example. Like, at the time, at least, it seemed like most people in the U.S. at the time were for that change, but most Americans were not for desegregation in the 50s, especially 54. The 60s maybe can make a different argument, but 54 definitely not. So it's very interesting. I know Derek Bell, he's considered the creator of the critical race theory, the right's current favorite boogeyman. He had this idea of what's called interest convergence. So I'm sure you've heard of it.
Yeah.
For the audience, I'll explain. It's the idea that, at least specifically talking about Black people here or other marginalized communities in the US, things don't improve for that marginalized group unless those changes somehow benefit, whether it's the repressing group or the capitalist class, whatever, however you want to do it. But I guess really this interest convergence idea, while it's often used in regards to race and racism in the US or in other countries, it really is kind of, I think maybe your entire argument kind of relates to it in a sense that there's an interest that converges. The capitalist class is like, oh, we don't want a revolution. We don't want people to be opposing our system. And the people down here are like, life sucks. We need change now. Their interests converge in that sense, and a concession is made.
Exactly. So you can kind of think of it like you've got all these forces sort of at a pressure point, and because you had this extra pressure coming in from the Soviet bloc, you had, the interests ended up moving maybe a little earlier than they otherwise would have, or so yeah, I think exactly that, the sort of convergence of interests. You can think of it that way.
But I did want to mention, another aspect of this desegregation also, I'm not sure you specifically mentioned in this article, but I think it's in line with the thesis, is the Soviet Union's implementation across the board of what we call affirmative action today. So massive support for marginalized groups,
Yeah.
whether it's the indigenous peoples in the northern part of the Soviet Union, the many different minority nationalities. There was really a huge investment by the Soviet state in education for these people, for healthcare, for even the preservation of languages, which is Canada right now. That's such a huge, there's huge movement by the First Nations peoples to have their languages invested in so that they are still used into the future. The Soviet Union was doing this like literally 100 years ago in terms of preserving these languages, even for the most quote unquote remote people from the center, from Moscow.
Yeah, I didn't talk about this in my essay, but I think one thing I was really surprised to learn when I started learning more about the USSR was just how much it promoted everyone learning in the language of their communities. So they had just so many different languages across the USSR, as opposed to, say, one language being imposed on them. Tying it back into the desegregation aspect, it was a really big cathartic moment for many Black Americans to go to the USSR and see how they were treated as Black people, which is to say that they were treated like any other person.
No, exactly. And so, specifically about this issue of affirmative action, I recommend people check out the episode I did with Alice and Dennis Bartels, where we talked extensively about the indigenous peoples of the Soviet Union, the northern peoples, and specifically how the different programs instituted by the state really help those people, and particularly when it comes to that area of language. Because in the U.S. in the 20th century, English only was like a huge. There's a huge push for English only, and the total destruction of indigenous languages through the residential school system in both the U.S. and Canada, and many other forms, and even the reserve system as well played a huge role in the destruction of these languages. We could talk about the next item in your article, which is about global health.
The global health example, I think, is one of my favorites that I talk about because I'm a scientist. And of course, in 2020 to 2023, we just experienced an outbreak of a new and deadly disease. And I think that the last 3 years would have gone down completely differently if we had maybe better understood how humanity was able to eradicate the disease of smallpox. And I think the reason that we don't actually tell that story of how we eradicated smallpox is because the major player in this story was the USSR. So, to set the stage a little bit for this, in the 1950s, Europe and North America had basically eliminated smallpox, but it was still killing 2 million people every year. To put the number in another context, in the 20th century alone, there were 300 million deaths that were attributed to smallpox. That was larger than all the world wars combined. One of the reasons that we were able to eliminate smallpox in these countries, so Europe and North America, is because we had a vaccine. It worked very well, and the vaccine was heat stable. So, although the USSR had managed to eliminate smallpox within its borders, in part because of very high vaccination rates, they still had some flare ups, and this is because of travel across their borders. So, they said, hey, rather than fighting these smallpox flare ups continuously, it would be better if we could just eliminate smallpox from the entire world. So, they went to the World Health Organization to try to eliminate smallpox worldwide, and it did pass as a motion, but WHO essentially allocated no funds for it. So, it made basically no progress at all for several years. At this time, the World Health Organization was instead fighting this malaria eradication program, and this was in large part because of the amount of backing that the United States was providing for it. But this program, the malaria eradication program, was having very limited success. So one of the reasons for this is that eradication of malaria has very different challenges than smallpox. It's spread by mosquitoes, which means that in order to eradicate malaria, you also have to eradicate mosquitoes, or at least mosquitoes carrying this disease. And this requires spraying a lot of chemicals on farms and other territories. And so this has a lot of environmental consequences. And also the mosquitoes were evolving resistance to these measures. So every year, the Soviet delegation went to the World Health Organization and would petition the assembly and argue for adequate funding for finally eliminating smallpox, and they would be rebuffed. But over time, they were getting more and more support from the Global South, where the disease was more prevalent. And as the malaria eradication program, which was being sponsored by the US, was showing increasing signs of failure and lack of achieving its goals, finally, the sort of tides were turning. And in 1965, there was this pretty incredible vote moment where the bill to fund the smallpox eradication program was approved based on the narrowest voting margin in WHO history. And so this is despite opposition from France and the United States trying to put a price cap on how much funding they would provide. So ultimately, it did pass, which I think is awesome. The project cost $98 million, and over 80% of the 2 billion vaccines that were required by the program were donated by the USSR, and they alone had the vaccine manufacturing facilities to produce this many vaccines. And so what then followed over several years was spreading these vaccines throughout the world and trying to find places where you still had incidents of the disease and whatnot. And I think it's a very cool story about how humanity managed to eradicate a disease. And the fact that it happened at all was just because of this tireless advocacy and material support by the USSR.
So, Alice, one thing that I found wild about this particular section when it comes to global health is if you look at, the COVID-19 pandemic, that capitalist governments, Western governments, they, of course, donated many vaccines to the global south. But what those donations often entailed, or always entailed, is those governments paying a huge amount of money to these corporations, to Pfizer, to Moderna, of course, for those corporations' own profit. But when you look at the Soviet Union, of course, they didn't work on a for-profit system. There was vaccines that were manufactured in the Soviet Union, weren't produced to make profit for capitalists, but were rather, of course, produced through means of production that was owned by the people, by the state itself. So I find that, that contrast so stark between the Soviet Union and capitalist powers and how they contribute to global health through, for example, the manufacturing of vaccines.
I think that's such a good point. And you can also imagine that if we were in a mostly socialist kind of world, you could still have this donation of vaccines. Or another thing you could also have is just removing IP protections on these vaccines, which these companies fought really hard to prevent. But if you remove patent protections, then you could have vaccine manufacturing not just in places like the United States or Moderna facilities and whatnot, but also in factories around the world so that people could be producing their own medicines that they need for themselves. And that produces jobs and better independence and security for these countries.
Yeah, we don't really have time to get into specific issue, but I just want to say shout out, of course, to Cuba for manufacturing their own vaccines
Yeah.
while under, a tremendous blockade that only really got worse during COVID due to the increased restrictions that Trump put on them. So that's definitely something people should definitely take a look at. So let's take a look at the next item in your article where you talk about education and research. Could you kind of give us an overview of what you wrote about in your article about that subject?
I talked about homeownership at the beginning, and this was fear of a revolution on US soil. And I think the education or research example that I give is interesting because it shows fear not of revolution on the soil, but fear of falling behind technologically and militarily. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was a satellite that orbited around the world and every hour and a half, and it sent out signals that you could tune into from like radio devices and whatnot. So everyone was able to track Sputnik and see for themselves the technological innovation that was coming out of the USSR. Also going on at this time, there had been a battle to improve access to education for Americans. And so there were bills that were going through the Senate, but Americans very much had this perspective, particularly the elites in America had this perspective that the role of government in the state was to facilitate business and to do very little else. So this was another theme that I highlighted in the homeownership section. The role of the state was not to provide a social safety net. And in my essay, I quote at length this one interview with Stuart McClure, who was a congressperson at the time. And he was reflecting on the role of Sputnik in helping to get these education bills finally passed. And he says, quote, "Yes, I think if there was one thing I ever did in my work on the Hill, my work for my whole career, it was to focus Lister Hill's attention on the opportunity which Sputnik, this Russian satellite, gave all of us who were struggling and had been for decades to establish a federal program of monetary aid to public education and private too in some instances. And I'm really proud of that," end quote. So the bill that they ended up passing at this time is the 1958 National Defense Education Act. It made available low-interest student loans for students that wanted to study areas that the United States thought would be useful for combating socialism. So that was things like foreign language, mathematics, and various science fields. The bill also originally included scholarship provisions, but these were eliminated during the debate process because it was considered to be giving a students, quote, a free ride, end quote, which would be too close to socialism, which they were, of course, trying to combat. And this bill also had this clause that was like a red scale clause. So anyone who received funds had to denounce or promise not to be part of any organization that believes in or teaches the overthrow of the United States government, which of course would include any communist or revolutionary kind of program. These rights to education and to research, they were implemented in a pro-capitalist way. So they were access to loans rather than universal rights to free education. And they were also all implemented in a temporary way. So these programs could expire, they could be overturned fairly easily, as opposed to something like a constitutional amendment that respected the right to education. And this is in contrast to what you see in socialist governments or socialist countries where you do have constitutional rights to education.
I'm not sure it was the specific law that you mentioned or you just mentioned now, in which you mentioned your article, in which one of the reasons the US politicians or policymakers determined that they were falling behind the Soviet Union in terms of technology was the fact that they were not incorporating women into their, scientific initiatives. So say, for example, when it comes to the enrollment of women, or the participation of women in the Soviet Union in scientific advancements and progress, it just way outstrips what the US was doing, what pretty much any other capitalist country was doing at the time. So I have some stats here to take a look at, which really show the insane gap between the two. So if we look at women who were enrolled in a biology program in university in the 1960s in the Soviet Union, it was 75%. while meanwhile, at roughly the same period, is only 36% of the people enrolled in that program were women. If we look at engineering, 40% of the people enrolled in an engineering program were female, and in the US, it was only 4.5%. So, really, just an insane and huge gap showing the investment that Soviet countries had in women compared to the US. Did you have any comments on that as a scientist yourself?
Exactly. I think it's a really good point. And as a woman in science myself, I think it's striking to see that places where you still have some of the highest rates of women participating in science and in engineering are countries that are former socialist or currently socialist countries.
What was interesting for me to learn about was how scientists around the world viewed the Soviet Union as a place of scientific advancement and a place where science wasn't done in a competitive way internally. Meanwhile, in the US, it was something, of course, there are different companies that were maybe competing against each other, which means that they weren't working necessarily collaboratively for certain advancements. People like Einstein, people like Nikola Tesla really looked to the Soviet Union as an example and an inspiration, and co-workers in the science that they were doing as well.
Yeah, I think it's like that's one of the things that really struck me when I started learning more about 20th century history is all these scientists that were socialists. Like you mentioned Einstein, he has a great essay. Bernal is a British communist member, and he was also the inventor of X-ray crystallography, and he has a really good essay also on the role of communism in science. He says, in its endeavor, science is communism, which I really like. Like science is a collaborative process where you are trying to strive to a particular truth and you collaborate in that, criticize each other, you try to revise your theories and whatnot. So I think that there is something to Marxism that resonates very well with scientists. I think that a lot of people sort of find that a lot of scientists will find that they have been doing Marxism this whole time.
So I want to make one last point. You started talking about scientific research being, of course, funded in the U.S. as a response to the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the satellite, and of course this begins a so-called space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And of course, the popular understanding is that the U.S. won this space race, particularly by landing on the moon, something the Soviet Union actually never achieved. But if one looks at the totality of while the Soviet Union still existed, the achievements made in space, becomes quite clear that the Soviet Union was often way ahead of the US in terms of their advancements in space. So looking at list here, so the Soviet Union got the first satellite in space, the first animal in space, they had the first photographs of the far side of the moon. Of course, they had the first person in space, the first man in space, the first woman in space. They did the first spacewalk. They had the first spacecraft landing on the moon. They had the first spacecraft landing on Venus, and of course, the first space station. But somehow, still, the US, of course, positions itself as the winner of the space race when really the only thing that were not the only thing, one of the main things that they were ahead on was landing on the moon, which hasn't at least wrought the benefits of, say, for example,
Yeah,
creating the
exactly.
first space
Yeah,
station.
they could have eliminated smallpox and made a movie about that instead.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. So the last aspect that Alice covers in her article is talking about human rights, but we're not going to speak about that. We're going to focus on some other questions. So I do recommend people check out the article to get kind of the full scope of all the different examples that Alice has just discussed for us. So, how did the end of the socialist bloc in the early 1990s impact the substantial working class gains, some of which you've just outlined?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main routes you can think about when you look at the impact of the dissolution of the USSR in the say 89 to 91. So afterwards, you had clawback of social progress, and you also had an uptick in imperialism. Now that the Western Empire was left unchecked. So one of the examples of clawbacks that I give in my essay is the super collider. So this leads in well from our education and research discussions. So there had been this planned super collider so you could better understand particle physics and things like that. And this was pretty much earmarked in. And then in 1992, there was a funding bill that was being reviewed, and they opted to completely cut this project. So I quote theoretical physicist and Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg here. He says, spending for the super collider had become a target for a new class of congressmen elected in 1992. They were eager to show that they could cut what they saw as Texas pork, and they didn't feel that much was at stake. The Cold War was over, and discoveries that the super collider were not going to produce anything of immediate practical importance. But, you can see this like clawback in social programs in so many different examples. So, for example, in Sweden, they cut the top corporate income tax rate in the early 90s. You saw similar things in Denmark and Austria and Norway. You saw sharp rises in inequality, and wealth taxes were repealed in many different countries. But one thing to think about for these clawbacks is also that social programs are sticky. So we're still seeing this process happening today, much later. Social programs are popular, so they're hard to repeal. Instead, the way that they tend to claw back these social gains that we've made in the mid 20th century is to underfund them, so that then you can point to these programs as failing, and then you can repeal them because you can say it's not working anyway. So this program has been called Starve the Beast by some people. I think one good example you see it is healthcare in Canada, where they're consistently woefully underfunding it and saying, hey, look, private health or public healthcare doesn't work. We need to reintroduce private health. On the imperialism angle, it's been highlighted by different people that the United States has increased its rate of interventions. So, for example, the US has conducted 400 total military interventions in its history. 50% of those were in the last 70 years and 25% were in the last 30 years. So the rate of new interventions pretty much doubled after 1990. And then another thing that the US started using more of is economic sanctions. So they restrict what kind of trades other countries can do with them. Without the USSR and other blocs that they can trade with, these countries really struggle to do things like feed their citizens and give medications to their citizens and other things like that. To summarize, the collapse of the USSR, or the dissolution of the USSR, produced a rollback of these social programs within the imperial core, and for countries outside it, there's increased colonialism or neocolonialism and imperialism.
Thanks for that summation. I mean, really, if you look at, I mean, we can talk for hours and hours about what just the collapse of the Soviet Union meant for the people in the Soviet Union or in the former Soviet Union. The lifespan people in the Soviet Union or Russia specifically dropped 7 years for quite a period of time following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And it took decades for that to rebound to where it had been during the time of the Soviet Union.
So there's a total destruction and hollowing out of publicly owned things in the Soviet Union after in the 90s. Going back to, say, for example, the U.S., we talked about racism and desegregation in the 1950s and 60s being in response to the so-called communist threat. Once the Soviet Union was gone, we see also the beginning of rollbacks of civil rights protections from the 60s. So things like the Voting Rights Act have been gutted extensively since then. And other mechanisms that were put in place, or affirmative action, again, is also another example of things that have been rolled back quite extensively since the 1990s. You mentioned healthcare rollbacks in Canada, the UK, the rest of Europe, the rise of neoliberalism really as being kind of the main expression of capitalism today. The housing crisis, I guess, is a main one too. Houses are just virtually unaffordable for the majority of people right now.
And lack of minimum wage increases and whatnot, all these things that sort of stopped improving around the time that around 1990, say. And I think that people will look at these failures that they see and they consider it to be some new form of capitalism. Like capitalism used to be kind of okay maybe 70 years ago, and now it is in some bad version of capitalism. We need to go back to the better version of capitalism, not realizing that this is just capitalism as it has always been. And for a brief moment in time, because of the threat that socialist countries posed, capitalism had to socialize a little bit itself and become not entirely capitalism.
To add on to the examples, stagnant wages, as you mentioned, anti-colonial movements have been arrested, or I did an episode with Gerald Horn talking about the role of the socialist bloc in ending apartheid in South Africa, and how really, with the help of Cuba and the Soviet Union and East Germany, South Africa was really positioned quite well to become a socialist country. But once the Soviet Union dissolved, there was no longer any viable option for whether it's the ANC or the South African Communist Party to really hold their own against the US or any other capitalist country in regards to maintaining a socialist country itself. Oh yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that really annoys me is when right wingers will make the argument that, things are declining in our society because since the 90s, or the past 30 years, what's been implemented in the US or in the West has been communism. As in, like, the reason there's a housing crisis is because communism. The reason healthcare is great is because communism. Can you speak to that kind of reversal of reality?
Or gay rights is communism or something like that. I think there's kind of a lack of understanding of what communism is. Communism is when workers have a say in their work environment and they benefit from the work that they do. Workers owning the means of production. Instead, it's sort of like this boogeyman, like communism is when the state does things, and that's not really it at all. I think it's a rhetorical part that maybe we need to fine tune our rhetoric for.
Clearly, one of my favorite definitions of communism is when communism is essentially when capitalism is functioning as it should.
Yeah.
What does this mean then for social democracy and other reform capitalist movements then, if their view, particularly in the 20th century, is that we need to make these incremental changes to improve our society, but clearly that's not the case as things have regressed quite extensively the past 30 years. What does that mean for those movements?
Like I sort of highlight in my essay, people point to this brief period in the 20th century that was somewhat worker friendly, not to diminish the violent interventions and the oppression of racialized people, not during this time, but they point to this era as an indicator of capitalism succeeding compared to now where it's failing or in decay or whatnot. And I think if you want to understand how we got all these reforms, you have to acknowledge the role that the socialist thread played in getting them. So, can you reform capitalism without the existence of the social threat? I don't think that there's evidence there that that works. If we want to use the mechanisms of the past to achieve these things, we also have to remember that they were clawed back. So we can't use the same method if we want to have lasting change. And capitalism has these mechanisms built into it to claw back these gains. So capitalism is kind of a spontaneous system. It's always going to be trying to evade whatever regulation you put on it. So, for example, in the 2010s, you had the rise of companies like Uber and Airbnb that they made profit purely based on the fact that they found a way around regulations for like taxis and hotels and whatnot. So whatever regulation you put on it, capitalism is going to try to find a way to innovate to get around the regulation. If you want to achieve better social benefits using reformism, you're always going to be fighting against this spontaneity or ingenuity of capitalism.
I'd recommend for those listening to check out Rosa Luxemburg's book entitled Social Reform or Revolution, which really goes in depth into demonstrating that, as you mentioned, reforms can easily be clawed back and aren't the solution, the lasting solution. And it's one thing that I find interesting as well, is that a lot of the answers to some of these questions that have been posed have been answered like a century ago, if not more. So it's definitely a reason why we should all be educated on the works of the socialists of the 20th century, who again, as you mentioned, through the socialist threat have really been the ones who brought about the changes that we saw in the 20th century. So getting to our last question, Alice, do the remaining socialist countries, such as Cuba, China, North Korea, do they have a similar impact as the Soviet Union did in the 20th century on capitalist countries? Is there a threat that they pose that has led to some gains or benefits for those living in capitalist countries?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a couple parts to it. So first, why was the USSR able to act as a threat in this way? For this question, it's because although they were far from a rich, developed country, they did have the resources to present as a credible challenge. Second, part of their ideological model was, particularly in the first years after 1917, was to spread revolution around the world in the Soviet model. So they actively fostered relationships and provided material supports to revolutionary groups around the world. And this also makes them a little bit more of a threat. Like they were definitely perceived as a threat in this way by elites around the world. And then in order for these countries to act as, or for the USSR to act as a threat, workers in the West have to be able to look at them and say, like, that is success and I want it in my country and we can achieve it in a similar way. So for the countries that you listed, I think that there's not quite these same conditions. So for example, for Cuba and for the DPRK, they're really tiny and they've been hit really hard by sanctions. They don't have the same resources to present as a credible challenge in the same way that the USSR had. China is perhaps more developed than these countries, and I think it is perceived as a threat by people in the United States, or by elites like the capitalist class, the political ruling class, perceive China as a threat. But China has a very different perspective on international relationships than the USSR did. So China does not export their mode. In fact, they call their governing philosophy socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that name really highlights that it's a model that it believes applies to China and shouldn't be adopted exactly as is to others. And I think that does make a difference in terms of, if you're looking for examples around the world, you can see that a socialist country is doing great things, but the way that you would need to enact socialism in your country is going to look different from how China has done it. So China is not like exporting socialism in the same way that the USSR was trying to foster socialism in other countries.
Would you say that, you kind of mentioned this, that these countries aren't necessarily presenting themselves as the necessary model to follow as the Soviet Union did? And so that's one thing. These own countries maybe not saying or exporting their revolution or their system to other places. So there's that on that end from those socialist countries. And then would you say also, I think North Korea as well, like they have Yushe, I don't know how to pronounce it,
Yeah,
but
they
they're
consider it, very much their homegrown, their own philosophy, and I don't think that they believe that that should be a particular model for other countries either. And then I think another way to answer your question is, do we want these countries to influence us in the same way as before? Like the lesson of the 20th century is very much that these concessions that were granted by the threat of socialism were temporary. And as soon as that threat let up a little bit because of the own problems that socialist nation was having, those reforms, they were all clawed back. They have started to dissipate, and we've had just neoliberalism and increased neocolonialism and whatnot. Yeah, the lesson is maybe not that we need China to scare our elites into giving us better welfare.
No, definitely. There's the current socialist countries, maybe not exporting the revolution. Then there's also this like massive propaganda campaign about the Soviet Union in the 20th century as being essentially the worst country that's ever existed, as being one of terror and repression, of no rights. So it's like, yeah, I guess both of these things don't create the same conditions the Soviet Union had in the 20th century.
Yeah, although propaganda against the Soviet Union was also very present and effective. I think they were making all the same sort of arguments like, oh, they don't have democracy there, or, whatnot, even though obviously if you look at the way the USSR operated and the way that China operated, like people do vote and voice their opinions and whatnot, and that does impact how the countries are run.
Alice, we've come to the end of our discussion today. Did you have any last words or any other, main point that you wanted to make before I let you go?
Like this essay very much came out of me trying to better understand how to make the world that I live in a better place. And I think that really helped me understand how socialist countries achieve these successes and how the West achieved their successes with the threat of socialism there. And I really encourage people to read the essay, and continue doing their own research to try to make their own communities better.
I want to say thank you so much, Alice, for writing this essay in the first place. I recommend everyone check it out. It's quite insightful, has a lot of sources in it as well, and really is really just a starting point for further research and further discussion and further compilation of this data into one place. So I want to say thank you for writing this article, and again, thank you for spending the time today to talk to me about it and to kind of work through some of the specific examples, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.